I have a couple of things to say as a preface to this talk. One or two, I should say at least three things. One is I have sort of a sore throat, as you can hear, and I might be croaking the talk. So please bear with me. Also, I had lunch out yesterday at a restaurant. I won't say what it was, where it was, but it wasn't in Montecito. And they had fish tacos. And when I got home, was I sick? Really, some sort of food poisoning, whatever it was. But I don't even want to think about it. And I really finally did fall asleep. And this morning I felt terrible. I wasn't sure I could make it. So I just waited and waited, and I'm well enough. The show must go on. Okay, also, as Kim mentioned, when we first planned to talk, I thought I could squeeze into 1 hour everything there was to say about writers in Montecito. However, as I dive deeper, I realized that would be an impossible task. For the hills and valleys of the village are alive with the sound of clacking keyboards. It would be impossible to do justice to the subject in 1 hour. So we've decided to divide it into 2 talks, and who knows, I might even take 3. Each will cover writers, both those who still walk among us and those who have passed on. Oh, one other thing. If you've come here expecting deep literary criticism of the works of our writers, you know, structuralism, postmodernism, semiotics, etc., you will be disappointed. No academic lit critic here. This will be rather a lighthearted look at some writers who have called Montecito home. Now, I have limited the talk to men and women who are principally writers, thus eliminating the many celebrity autobiographies and do-it-yourself and how-to authors, charming as some of their books may be. So there's no Oprah, Rob Lowe, Ellen, Carol Burnett, Jonathan Winters, Dennis Miller, Tipper Gore. My God, the list goes on. Now, some Montecitans have written very fine books to tell the story of survival, of war or disease. For example, Karen Fennell and Beverly Hyman Feed. And as wonderful as these books are, they are not, quote, literature, whatever that may be. Also, 2 of the greatest food writers called Montecito home, and no one still does. Excuse me, one still does. Julia Child, she lived in Bonnymead and in Casa Dorinda, and happily still with us, the irrepressible Betty Fussell, also at Casa Dorinda. I've also not included journalists. However, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Thomas S. Stork. He was a longtime owner of the Santa Barbara News Press, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his editorials condemning the John Birch Society back in the 50s. And he did write a book. It was called California Editor. More importantly for our purposes, he lived in Montecito on Shellam Way, and he remains here. Rather, his remains remain here in Montecito at 901 Channel Drive. That's the cemetery, which is in Montecito. And also, there are a few Montecito connections with teaching creative writing. The annual Santa Barbara Writers Conference has to be mentioned. Started by Barnaby and Mary Conrad in 1972, the first 2 were held at Kate School, but then it moved to the Miramar Hotel, where it continued until the demise of that place. One of its longtime and influential workshop leaders was Shelley Lowenkopf, who at that time lived on Danielson Road with his wife Anne, also a much revered writing instructor. Two long-term stalwarts of the conference are Diane Robb of Sycamore Canyon Road and the ever-enthusiastic Susan Gilbranson, long a resident of Featherhill Road, book reviewer, columnist, and cheerleader for Santa Barbara authors. Okay, so let's start off with some of the writers who are alive and presumably well. Right. I'm having some problems here getting this thing going. Oh, hey, Greg, can what?
Oh, you have to just
So now I can
go
get
down.
down. Oh, okay. Sorry. Sorry, folks, bear with me. This is my first Zoom talk, so I'm a bit of a novice. So let's start off with Fanny Flag. In a recent New York Times review of one of her novels, she was referred to as a loved author. And so she is. Her best-selling novels, starting with Fried Green Tomatoes, have found their way into the hands and hearts of millions of devoted readers. Born and raised in Alabama as Patricia Neal, she changed her name when she went to apply for her Screen Actors Guild card and learned Patricia Neal was the name of a well-known actress. So she changed it to something rather amusing. I thought she was a comedian at the time. And they say you can take the girl out of Alabama, but you can't take Alabama out of the girl. And so every year she returns to Birmingham, where she has a home, to soak in some of the good Southern cooking. Well, in 1975, she was living in LA and getting ready to move back to New York when a friend suggested she join her for a drive up to Santa Barbara for lunch. Excuse me. It was love at first sight. It was so charming and pretty, she said. In short order, she bought a little house in the Montecito hedgerows and moved in. She lived there until recently, and she sold the house. Excuse me, let me go back. These are personal books you all know and love. This is her house in the hedgerows, 1520 Lorena Lane. But you can't go over there and bother her. She doesn't live there anymore. But you know, I did find something interesting. When I looked through her books on the copyright page, I saw it says copyright by Lorena Lane Productions. So that's an obscure piece of information. You can dazzle your friends with who are Fanny Flag people. Anyway, let me go back to what happened about Montecito, because she lived there, excuse me, little did she know that her move to Montecito would change her life. When she came here, she was a TV regular on game shows and scripted series, but writing and the appreciation of great writing was in her blood. So when shortly after settling in, she saw a flyer about the famous Mississippi writer, Eudora Welty, one of Flag's idols. And she was going to be speaking at the annual Santa Barbara Writers Conference in Montecito. Well, she just had to be there. And it would prove to be a life-changing event. On the first day of the conference, the assignment was to write a story inspired by the word childhood. This was unsettling for Flag, for she describes herself as so severely dyslexic that she cannot spell. But she was afraid that if she didn't complete the assignment, she wouldn't get to hear Welty speak. So her answer was to write her short story in the voice of an 11-year-old girl, so that her spelling mistakes would be perceived as intentional. Smart girl. And she won first prize with none other than Welty handing her the prize. Well, Flag was embarrassed, feeling as if she had cheated when everyone was congratulating her for being so clever. Well, the short story found its way to a publisher in New York who wanted to turn it into a novel. He confessed to the publisher it was impossible because she couldn't spell. He started laughing. He said, "What do you think editors are for?" So the story became her first novel, Coming Attractions, which was published in 1981. And it was reissued in 1992 under the title Flag, originally wanted to use Daisy Fay and the Miracle Man. Oh, when I was telling you about Lillian Lee, if you go there, she's no longer there, and don't bother her anyway, because she moved. She moved to Burnham Wood, into this gorgeous house. So let's move on. We all know this fellow, T as in Tom, C Boyle. Well, he's been publishing since his first collection of short stories came out in 1979. Native of New York State with a stop at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. He's been a member of the English department at USC since 1978. In 1993, the then 42-year-old author was living in Los Angeles when the movie rights to his novel, The Road to Wellville, landed him a lucrative film deal, thus enabling he and his wife and 3 children to move to Montecito. As he later wrote, quote, "Over the Labor Day weekend, I moved with my family to Montecito, an unincorporated area of some 10,000 souls contiguous to Santa Barbara. The house we bought was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1909 and had been on the market for well over a year, as a majority of prospective buyers apparently didn't want to negotiate the soul-wrenching, divorce-provoking drama of restoration required. Built of redwood with a highly flammable, and as I was later to learn, leaky shake roof, the house was in need of a foundation." I'm just going to have you look at some other things that are more amusing. Talk about the house in a minute. So we stocked the larder up, set up beds for the children, and taking advantage of the crisp, bugless night, my wife and I tossed a mattress on one of the 2 sleeping porches and wound up sleeping outside off and on until we were able finally to accomplish the move of our furniture up from LA 3 months later. Now, of all these Montecito authors, he is the only one of the very few to set some of his short stories and novels in Santa Barbara under its real name. Others have done that, but they seem to want to change Santa Barbara to Santa Teresa or something like that. And beginning almost 25 years ago with Riven Rock. The other 2 you see here take place in Montecito and Santa Barbara in the Channel Islands, and great books. This is his house, Summit and Hot Springs. This is the interior, typical Franklin, right? Typical pose, the author. Here's Melody Johnson Howe. She was an actress in Hollywood and has used that insider knowledge in a series of detective novels and short stories. She became tired of the Hollywood grid. She left her movie career behind to pursue her dream of writing mysteries, and she set down to do just that. A few years later, she completed her first mystery novel, The Mother's Shadow. Though rejected by 7 publishers, it was finally accepted by Viking, which brought it out in 1989, and it was nominated for an Edgar Award. Married to the legendary record producer and sound engineer, Bones Howe, they moved to Montecito and bought a home on Park Lane. And they and their 3 children lived there from 1995 to 2010. When they decided it was time to downsize, sold the house and moved into town. Dorothy Durfner grew up in Long Island's Freeport area of New York. Came out in LA to LA in the 70s when her sister Diane was a successful casting director. She started writing screenplays. She also married Academy Award-winning screenwriter Frank Pearson in 1978. Back then, she was characterized in a newspaper article at the time as, quote, an insider who knows where the bodies are buried and what the big secrets are. And at that time, she was shopping a screenplay titled The Platinum Yo-Yo, which was a thinly veiled story of the relationship between Barbra Streisand and the hairdresser John Peters. And of course, no studio would touch it, Streisand having such power, and nothing ever came of it. In 1983, then divorced from Pearson, though she kept his name, she met her husband, Chris Carter, a handsome, blonde, native Southern California surfer, when he was running a surfing magazine. They would marry 4 years later. Carter, after seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark 6 times in 6 days, began to entertain the idea of becoming a screenwriter. Dory encouraged him, and she had some connections. So around 1986, she introduced him to Jeffrey Katzenberg at Disney. He was hired on a standard contract to write TV films for the studio. Well, the rest is history, because he did write a program we all know called The X-Files, premiered in 1993, ran to 2002, and made him very, very, very rich man. Dory decided she was going to write novels. She was so amazed, she wrote the amazingly titled Beautiful Wasps Having Sex. It came out in 2000. And it's a very funny takedown of Hollywood. It's really something else. Well, they moved to Montecito, to Picacho Lane. Do I have a picture of that? Yeah, it's. And they also began sort of collecting properties, things in, oh God, in LA on the beach. I mean, there's a couple of hot springs. I think that was a hobby. And she spent 5 years here working on a novel called We Are Rich. It was published in 2009. And she doesn't use the real name Montecito or Santa Barbara. She calls it Rancho Esperanza, which I thought was strange because, as you know, Rancho Esperanza means Hope Ranch in Spanish. Yet it's clearly a book about Montecito. And it's very unusual in that she has put photographs of her friends at the beginning of each chapter, because each chapter is a separate story about certain people that live in this town. So it's a novel of linked stories. When somebody asked her how she saw herself in the wider world of Rancho Esperanza and Montecito, this is what she said. I am just an observer. Being a writer, I work. So I'm not out there as much as other people are. I'm not retired yet. There are a lot in Montecito who are. They have a lot of time to sit on boards, go to fundraisers constantly. I just don't have the time or the money. I think writers are outsiders. If they were insiders, They'd be living it, not writing about it. I love that quote. Joanna Barnes. She was born in Boston, Brahmin Hill family, stockbroker's daughter, socialites. She went to Smith, class of 56, English major, Phi Beta Kappa. But she wanted to be in the movies, so she immediately moved to LA soon after graduation and landed a contract with Columbia Pictures. She would appear in more than 20 films. She also had a TV interview show, if you're old enough to remember, called Dateline Hollywood. Well, when she went into the movies, the Boston Social Register dropped her because she had become an actress. I remember her when she was an Auntie Mame. She was very funny, played sort of against, well, she always seemed to be playing society. She looks like she's from Boston society lady. She's gorgeous. Anyway, when she moved here, she became what she called a dedicated Californian. And she became one of the leading society figures in LA. She was on the board of the Chamber Symphony Society, prominent member of Junior League, and she reviewed books for the LA Times. In 1970, she started writing novels. The first one was The Deceivers, sort of a Jackie Collins kind of book. Then she came out with 3 more over the next 15 years. She also wrote weekly book review for the Times. And she was single. Well, she had been married, got divorced, and started dating men like the actor Gary Merrill, G. David Shy, George Stevens Jr., and most interestingly, for quite a long time, Henry Kissinger. Then she met Jack Warner. And Jack Warner was probably the most prominent well-known architect in Santa Barbara, with an office in Montecito, especially in Coast Village Road. She married him in 1980. They lived on Middle Road. They had one house, and then they decided to build another one. It's a very unusual house. If you go by it, you'll see it. Very nice. He designed it, of course. He retired from practice in 2005. And both of them, they moved to Sea Ranch up in Sonoma County. And he died in 2012. She still lives there. You got a peek at my next one. Probably the most polarizing figure, literary, if you want to call her literary, who ever lived here. As Ariana Stacillopolis, she had published 2 books when she married Texas oil millionaire Michael Huffington in 1986. She was described then as a woman of charm, intelligence, and ceaseless drive. Now, in 1988, they purchased $4.5 million, 11,000 square foot Italian style villa on Ribbon Rock Road. It was called Villa Rucella. There, she put the finishing touches on the Picasso book, released later that year, and became quite controversial about the kind of things she said about him. Now, the real reason for moving to Montecito, or Santa Barbara really, was so that Huffington could launch his political career. And he created some, perhaps a lot of animals. Many felt that they essentially snookered the town. He introduced himself to Santa Barbara by writing checks to a number of local charities, wooed various society figures. And then in 1992, he announced that he was challenging longtime Congressman Bob Lagomarsino in a Republican primary. But thanks to a very shrewd decision, on his part to embrace a pro-choice position on abortion. He won, spent a fortune. Now, by every account, since Huffington reached Washington, he showed little interest in representing our concerns. He didn't serve the community well. In fact, Nick Welsh, the Indy, the angry poodle, referred to him always as the alleged congressman. However, he wasn't through because, his real ambition was to become a senator. So he launched a campaign in the Democratic primary to unseat Dianne Feinstein. He was meant to defeat this time around. Of course, at this point, why stay in Santa Barbara anymore? There's no reason. Following year, he sold the house for $8.9 million, moved to LA. Now, Ariana, she does remember her years very fondly. She said there was her beautiful 11,000 square foot Italianate villa, and more meaningfully, the births of her 2 daughters. That was like an incredibly beautiful time in my life, because that is where I became a mother. Well, that's her little villa, compliment in rock. While she remembers things fondly through the maternal lens, many of the locals remembered the interview differently. Wells said it was like a bad dream we woke up from, and we're glad they're gone, describing her as luminously self-obsessed, a shape-shifting succubus. It doesn't mince words. And this is her at the time in front of the villa. It's another picture I think I have here. Oh, I remember, because I was living in Montecito at the time, seeing her around. I remember more her mother. She brought her mother here, really as sort of a nanny for the 2 young girls. And it would be up here in the farm often, and the girls would jump into the pool and swim. We brought towels, food. It was really quite amazing to see. So now let's move on to some of the people who are no longer with us and more obscure. Well, raise your hands if you know who this man is. The shy New Englander was in Harvard in the early 1880s, as his father and grandfather and great-grandfather before him, where he was editor-in-chief of the Lampoon, the college humor magazine. And it just so happened on the staff was future newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. Well, a couple years after graduating, Hearst, who had been given the San Francisco Examiner by his dad to run, asked Thayer to join the staff. He accepted, and over time he wrote many little pieces, humorous poems, doggerel, all sorts of things. Well, one of these was a little poem called Casey at the Bat. Now, it may have remained in obscurity, but it came into the hands of a prominent actor of the time who thought it would be a great piece for his act. Well, it became a sensation. The actor subsequently made a career of it, reciting thousands of times all over the country for the next 40 years. Now, the strange thing was that the author himself could not decently recite it. He once did so for the actor. This is what the actor said about his performance. Thayer, in a sweet, dulcet Harvard whisper, he implored Casey to murder the umpire and gave this cry of mass animal rage. All the emphasis of a caterpillar wearing rubbers crawling on a velvet carpet. He was rotten. And it embarrassed Thayer his whole life, such a shy man. And everybody would see him, oh, you go Casey at the Bat, recite it for me. And he really decided to live a very quiet life. So in 1912, the batsman, nearing 50, retired to Santa Barbara. There he met Rosalind Buell Hammett, a wealthy widow from St. Louis. She was staying at the Miramar. They married the following year and set up a household on Hickson Road on the Old Coast Road, actually right across from the Miramar. And that has since been destroyed by the construction of the freeway. As I said, he led a very quiet life, died peacefully in 1940. Many people thought he had already died. Now, there's a sort of an unfortunate coda to the story involving his stepson. He was called Buell Hammett. Very well-educated, sensitive fellow. He and three of his friends started the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, and he was actually the first president. He was a World War I veteran. So when the Second World War began, he was too old to serve, but he was selected to head the Home Guard. Well, he got into an argument one day with one of the other members of the Guard. It became a screaming match. They both drew guns they were carrying. Hammett shot the man and his wife and killed him. The other guy returned fire before that happened, almost killed Hammett. So it was, by the coroner, termed justifiable homicide. He was in the hospital for a long time, went into a deep depression, never really recovered, and he died soon thereafter. Sad story.
Someone asked if you could speak a little louder.
Oh,
let me.
Okay. You know, I'm sorry about my voice because Kim will turn it up. I hope that's okay. Maybe when you have some tea. Try not to slurp. She looks like Myrna Loy or some movie star from the 30s, doesn't she? Well, Emily Tremaine, now she's not to be confused, as some people have, with Kit Tremaine, who in fact was her sister-in-law, and were both passionate about architecture. This Tremaine was born Emily Hall. She more or less grew up in Montecito in the 20s at her parents' Glen Oaks estate. When she was 20, she met and married an 18-year-old German aristocrat named Baron Maximilian von Lamberg. They had fun for a while, and then she became bored. He loved to fly planes. He played polo all the time. She became a polo widow. And she was bored with she said, the endless parade. That's my place. The endless parade of parties, teas, dances. She decided that she had been hiding her genius for editing a magazine under a beach umbrella. This was in New York. By the way, they had an air honeymoon. They flew across the country in his little plane. So she decided she was going to start a magazine, sort of a gossipy magazine on arts and society, and with a tone of mockery and wit, sort of like a West Coast New Yorker. And it was going to be called Aperitif. It was beautifully designed. She hired Stanton Delaplane as the editor, a young man here named Campbell Grant as the art director. Well, so soon as the magazine got going and the fur began to fly. As a lark, she had an idea. Now, wouldn't it be interesting to have some of her socialite friends pose for mugshots, sort of a rogues gallery? But she would mix up the photos with some real criminals. The idea was, she said, to guess who were the society people and who were the criminals. What fun. However, the concept boomeranged, and she had to go around pulling all the issues from LA to San Francisco. Well, this is Mrs. Eleanor Gould Stevens, the name Gould, you might remember. Was very, very upset about this picture being painted. So she had to push the issues. Meanwhile, 1936, she and her husband commissioned Luder Riggs to build a sprawling house on the southwest corner of Pepper Lane and Hot Springs Road. It was finished in the autumn of 38. Unfortunately, the Baron never saw it completed. He died in an air crash in June of that year. There she is, posing. And this house was called Blumingshausen, named after a home that they had, where he had come from in Germany. I think these pictures were from Architectural Digest of the time. In 1936, she had another marriage, a lot of adventures. Finally, she settled down and married the wealthy industrialist Burton G. Tremaine. And they became world-class collectors of contemporary art. She claimed she discovered Warhol. She did this for the next 40 years, amassing an incredible collection till her death in 1987. And the collection was sold for hundreds of millions of dollars. And recently, the Getty Museum publishers have brought out this book about her family and Kit Tremaine's family, because they both built amazing houses. This is, I believe, is a Richard Neutra house that Kit Tremaine built in Montecito. If you don't know who she was obviously very wealthy. She was a philanthropist, mainly to liberal causes, politically active, wrote a little poetry, a nice little memoir. Here's somebody. I love this guy because of his name. It's Hobart Chatfield Tim. And the way he got the hyphenated name came about because he had a wealthy uncle, Chatfield, who said he would leave his fortune to young Hobart if he attached his name to his surname. Well, he wasn't hesitant about that, so Hobart Chatfield Taylor became Hobart Chatfield Taylor. He was wealthy, very wealthy in his own right, very serious Chicago money. And he married more. He was what you would call a sportsman and gentleman of letters. He wrote many novels beginning in 1891. And he wrote a biography of Molière, a French comic dramatist of the 17th century. His books, frankly, were not very good. That's probably why you've never heard of them, sort of deservedly dying obscurity, but they were popular. When he arrived in Montecito in 1916, he was famous enough that the front page of the Santa Barbara paper carried this headline: "Noted author chooses this of all the world." And he was part of that group of Chicago millionaires, think Armour, Fleischman, etc. They came to Montecito around the same time and built fabulous homes. He built one called Farfield. Up in Hot Springs, it's quite a spread, 10.5 acres. And I just saw this in the paper recently. It said Farfield is on the market for $74 million. If sold at that price, it would be the most expensive home ever sold in Santa Barbara. So it's available, people. Now, he, unlike some of the Chicago people, made Santa Barbara his permanent residence, and he became part of the civic fabric of the city. And he was part of a group of prominent citizens who put on La Primavera in 1920. Now, that was to be an annual festival celebrating California's poetic past. Unfortunately, it only lasted that 1 year. And he and a couple of other writers wrote a dramatic play about it for it to be shown. But all was not lost, for it inspired another group 4 years later to create what would be the old Spanish days fiesta. And they used some of the costumes and ideas from La Primavera. He was also instrumental in forming the Montecito Water District. Well, in 1937, he went to England to attend the coronation of King Edward VI and suffered a near fatal heart attack. His doctors forbade him to attend meetings and even climb stairways. So he wisely took their advice and withdrew from public life. Seemed to have worked for a while. He survived 6 more years. His widow sold Farfield and moved to New York. He remained behind, entombed in the Santa Barbara Cemetery. Now, some people think, excuse me a minute, that Robert Louis Stevenson lived in Santa Barbara, Montecito. Not true. It was his widow. Fanny Osborne was a divorcee with 2 children, and she met Stevenson. They married in 1880. In 1889, the family moved to the Pacific island of Samoa. And there they would remain for the 5 years the author had left to live. He was buried on the island. Fanny and the children returned to the United States, settling in San Francisco. In 1906, while visiting Monte Carlo, she met a woman who talked enthusiastically about the charm of an estate in Montecito called Stonehenge. It was located on Hot Springs Road. She loved it. She bought it moving in 1908. She also bought a rather nice beachfront house, Serena, near Carpinteria, and it's so known as Serena. She spent much of her time writing. She did the introductions to all of Stevenson's books. She would remain at Stonehenge until her death in 1914. And the people that bought it, let me say this, she stayed there, and it stayed in her family until 1926. And the buyer in 1926 retained that house and that family until 2019, when the 6.7 acres was offered at $14.5 million. It was bought by Rob Lowe. She also owned an estate on Middle Road and Oak Roads called Green Acres, which her daughter occupied. Besides, she also occupied the 20 acres in Serena over in Sandyland. And we'll go back and forth between the 2 homes for decades. Now, her daughter, Belle, married her mother's personal secretary, and some say lover. His name was Edward Salisbury Field. Yes, this is actually a picture taken at the time. There it is today. So Belle was a painter, a writer. She wrote a terrific memoir, a follow-up to it. And she married Salisbury Field, who was also a writer and quite a popular one. And he was 20 years younger than her. So she stayed in Serena Beach until 1947, when she was 90. Selling it, she moved into the El Mirasol Hotel, which was now the site of Alice Keck Park. Her health deteriorated and she died there 4 years later. This is one of her memoirs. The other one is called A Bit of My Life. And she, if you read them, she's a wonderful storyteller and really quite witty and very acute observations, I thought. Well, now we're going to talk about really interesting lady. I hope some of you know who she is. And Beryl Markham grew up in what is now Kenya. She was an adventurous spirit, trained horses, and took up flying. In 1937, she became the first woman to fly the Atlantic from east to west, and the first person of either sex to fly from England to North America. A couple of years later, she was invited to Hollywood as an aviation advisor to a major film studio. There she met a man, maybe not so good screenwriter, named Raoul Schumacher. He encouraged her to write a memoir, and he acted as her editor. The book, West with Night, met with great critical success. It came out in 1942. It's the one on the left. However, due to the war having just started, the sales were not all that hot. They fell in love and they married in 1942. And 3 years later, they moved to Montecito. They didn't buy a house. Turns out they were friends of the conductor, Leopold Stokowski. He was considered somewhat of a genius, a real ladies' man. Lived a long time. And he's probably best known today for his part in Fantasia. He's the conductor that steps up on the podium and starts all the magic happening. Anyway, he was living in Hollywood, and he bought a place, a 17-acre place on Toro Canyon Road, which he called a monastery. And he and his lover would escape from LA. By the way, his lover was named Greta Garbo, and hang there. So Garbo had departed. He wasn't using it very much. Reason? He had married little Gloria Vanderbilt that year. She was 42 years younger than he was. And Gloria did not like the ranch and all that outdoor stuff. So he vacated. By the way, he wouldn't actually sell it until 1987. But Beryl loved it. She was totally at home there. Friends said she was never happier. She would go horseback riding. And they would go down to the Coral Casino and hang out with her friends, have dinner, drive around town. Great life. Unfortunately, the marriage really went south. And Beryl left Schumacher. Actually, she left the United States in 1949, never to return. Although before quite leaving, she used her time to have another well-known affair with a folk singer by the name of Burl Ives, who later became a Montecito resident. Raoul returned to Toro Canyon after Beryl left. He tried to write, but soon lapsed back into bouts of heavy drinking. And though he sat every day in front of the typewriter, he didn't produce anything that was published. And he never got around to divorcing Markham until 1960. The reason was he wanted to marry Gertrude Chase Green. That Chase might be a familiar name. She was the very wealthy daughter of Harold Chase, the man responsible for creating Oak Ranch, and the brother of the civic leader Pearl Chase. Well, he was in poor health even at the time of the marriage, very overweight. He had a fatal heart attack 2 years later at the age of 55. And you might think that's the end of the story, but sometimes people have a second act. Because in 1983, North Point Press found the book, reprinted it with this very fetching cover. It's a trade paperback, and it shot to #1 on the bestseller list, made a fortune. Well, at that time, Markham was 81 years old and living in near poverty in Africa, being helped financially by friends. With the republication of the book, the royalties enabled her to enjoy some comfort for the remaining few years of her life. And the world would be reminded of a minor literary masterpiece and the life of a uniquely adventurous woman. There's Schumacher, the horses. This is the monastery. They're on Montoro Canyon Road, a little out of focus. This, by the way, is a rare picture of the maestro on the right with Lottie Lehman, well, the famous soprano who was so much identified with the Music Academy. And on the left is Martha Graham. Now, I would say that Martha Graham is the greatest artist Santa Barbara ever, what can I say, I'm not sure she was created here, ever had, because, you know, Martha Graham grew up here and she went to Santa Barbara High School, actually. And then obviously she had a fantastic career. The picture was even on a postage stamp. She's amazing. Anyway, so a picture of all three of them together in front of the libero. This is Barrow at the monastery. She loved animals. Okay. Edmund Wilson, excuse me. If you're deep into mid-century, I'm talking about the 20th century, American literature, you know him because he was, I would say, is considered the greatest critic of that period. I mean, he's so great that he's the only critic that has been into the American library. His essays. And here, in the 30s, that was a collection of his notebooks, letters, etc. They're amazing. He's an amazing writer. And that comes back to Santa Barbara. Because he met this woman, Margaret Waterman Canby, described as a small, attractive woman, barely 5 feet tall, carefree, fun-loving, down-to-earth, and unintellectual. This is how Wilson is connected to Montecito. She was the daughter of Isaac George Waterman. He had made a fortune in Pennsylvania coal fields. And after marrying Jean Alexander in 1892, they moved in a small house of acreage and Waterman had purchased near Sycamore Canyon and Ashley Road. He set about expanding the home, adding a music room and a large west wing made of stone. He engaged Elizabeth Burton, a major figure in Santa Barbara's arts and crafts movement, to design the gardens, which emphasized the woodland effect. He christened their estate Mira Vista. And the home became a social center as more wealthy Easterners began to flock to the region. In 1917, young Margaret married James Canby. He was somebody who worked once in a while as a stockbroker, but pretty much was hung out in the social scene, was a rather popular figure. But her cousin by marriage was George Washington Smith, famous architect, and he designed a house for them on Mesa Lane and Hot Springs Road, 1922. However, it was sold 3 years later to a widow from Boston named Edith Cunningham, who hired Smith to extensively enlarge the property. Now, she met Wilson during his trip to San Francisco in March of 1924, while she was waiting for a divorce from Canby. They married in 1930. He would come down here. He mainly lived in New York, but spent a lot of time in Montecito. Now, here's something he wrote. I have a little house here on the beach and have done nothing but read, write, and swim. The weather is beautiful and all the days are exactly alike. The calm Pacific spaces are excellent for work. I always feel cramped in New York, but if you stayed out here very long, you would probably cease to write anything because you would cease to think. It isn't necessary out here, and the natives regard it as morbid. I must say, there's lots of Easterners come up California, Santa Barbara, and Montecito especially. They love to make these snide little remarks about how you can't write here, nothing's done. People are rather banal. In fact, I collected an entire booklet of the terrible things that people have said about Montecito. It's called Why Are People Saying Bad Things About Montecito? Of course, nobody's going to publish it. It's pretty funny. Marriage would last only a year and a half. And this is what happened. Margaret went to a party at El Paseo. It took place in the studio of her friend, the artist Clarence Matty, as in Matty's Tavern. And he had painted a picture of her portrait sometime before this. It was on the second floor above the open central courtyard. It was foggy, drizzling, as she descended the warm, unevenly tiled, open staircase. Excuse me. She fell on her head, died instantly. Well, it was pretty awful, very devastating for Wilson. But as a writer, he did make writer's capital of it. Came back on the next train. And he wrote incessantly in his journals about how much he loved her, what their life was like, and lots of discussion about his friends in Montecito, what Montecito was like. A very powerful piece. And that's in his book, The 20s, if you're interested in reading it. Okay. I think we all know her. Perhaps she's Santa Barbara's best-known, biggest-selling author ever. Her 25 Kinsey Millhone alphabet mysteries made her a very wealthy woman. Now, if you were fortunate enough to have bought the first edition of A is for Alibi and had her sign it, kept it in the dust jacket in pristine condition, you could probably sell it for $8,000. Who had the foresight back then? And by the way, that is the license plate that she actually had on her car. When she was living in LA in an apartment building, one of the other people living there was a student of philosophy named Stephen Humphrey. And they moved to Columbus, Ohio, so that Steve could get his PhD. Then in the mid-'80s, he moved to Santa Barbara, a place she had known, and actually lived there much, much earlier. Her first house was on San Leandro Lane. She was asked, by the way, how could she live in such Edenic settings and write about the gritty world in which Kinsey operates? She replied, Kinsey spends a lot of time in the houses of the wealthy, going around and gaping at them. So do I. They moved to a little larger place. Yep, and built this amazing house on Picacho Lane. You know, something interesting about her books. The first novel was published in 1981. And it also takes place in 1981. Well, subsequent novels are separated by only a few months in Kinsey's life, while the publication dates are about a year and a half apart. Thus, with each novel, Kinsey's life gets further and further away from the year of the novel's publication. And Grafton once said that because she cannot impose current technology onto the decade of the 80s, that what seems so current about Kinsey in the first novel will seem out of date and old-fashioned by the time the series is finished. Thus, today, 2021, her novels take place almost 40 years ago. As if someone first reading A in 1981 and the action took place 40 years earlier, 1941. It would be an historic novel and an historic poem. This was her office, Picacho Lane. This is a picture taken, obviously, so they had 3 kids, 2 grandchildren, one of whom is named, of course, Kinsey. And you know, she was from Louisville, Kentucky originally, and she loved Louisville. We go back there very often. And finally, she bought a home. And I mean, a huge home on the Ohio River, fantastic gardens. It looks like it should be a public garden, public building. And when she passed away, 2017, she did pass away here, Cottage Hospital, 1 book away from the finish line. She had just published Why. Her daughter said there will never be a Z. They'll never hire somebody to do it. Just about finished, sort of ironic. Her husband sold the house in Picacho, moved to Louisville, and has allowed groups to come in and visit the house, tends the gardens. If you're ever in Louisville, this is an amazing place to visit.
Just want to give an extra thank you to Steve for doing this presentation tonight. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you so much, Steve.
Oh, that was great.
Oh, thank you.
We look forward to part 2.
Okay.
Thanks. Have a good
Bye-bye.
night, everyone.
Night.
Thank you.